Experience the intimate world of Constantinople, May 28th, where every moment holds the weight of unspoken understanding. In this peaceful journey through time, you'll discover the quiet dignity of people living their daily lives, unaware of how their small gestures reveal the depths of human experience. The pre-dawn darkness of the bakery held a warmth that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of centuries, the air thick with the lingering essence of yesterday's ovens and the promise of bread yet to come. Anna Paleologina moved through this familiar darkness with the certainty of inherited knowledge, her bare feet finding their way across wooden floors, worn smooth by generations of her family's morning rituals. The single candle she had lit cast dancing shadows against walls blackened by decades of smoke and flour dust, creating a world that existed somewhere between dream and waking, between the ancient rhythms of her craft and the strange stillness that had settled over Constantinople in recent weeks. Her hands found the bowl of dough she had prepared the night before, the surface slightly crusted, but yielding beneath her palms as she began the work her grandmother had taught her when she was barely tall enough to reach the wooden table. The dough responded to her touch with the familiar resistance and surrender that had become as natural to her as breathing, each fold and turn a conversation between her hands and the living mixture that would soon become the bread her neighbors had come to expect each morning. The rhythm was ancient, comforting, a meditation that required no thought yet contained within it all the wisdom of women who had stood in this same spot, performing this same ritual for longer than anyone could remember. Flory motes danced in the candlelight like tiny spirits celebrating the continuation of something sacred and ordinary, something that connected her to her grandmother's grandmother and to all the women who had risen before dawn to feed their community. Anna did not think of the ships that had appeared in the harbor, their dark silhouettes multiplying each day like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. She did not think of the sounds that had been growing louder each night, the strange mixture of voices and metal that seemed to drift across the water with the evening breeze. Instead, she focused on the texture beneath her palms, the way the dough yielded and resisted in equal measure, the promise of warmth that would soon fill this small space and spill onto the street where neighbors would gather as they had for decades. The bakery itself seemed to participate in this morning ritual, the wooden beams settling with soft creaks that sounded almost like sighs of contentment, the stone floor radiating the accumulated warmth of countless fires. Through the small window that faced east, she could see the faintest suggestion of dawn beginning to touch the edges of the sky, though the stars still burned with unusual brightness, as if the heavens themselves were drawing closer to witness whatever was about to unfold in the world below. The distant sound of waves against the seawall mingled with the soft whisper of her kneading, creating a symphony of continuity that seemed to exist outside of time, outside of the concerns that made other citizens of the city lie awake in their beds. As she worked, Anna found herself remembering her grandmother's hands, how they had moved with the same assured grace, the same unconscious precision that came from a lifetime of practice. Those hands had taught her not just the technique of bread making, but something deeper, something about the importance of maintaining the small rituals that held the world together, even when larger forces threatened to tear it apart. Her grandmother had lived through other times of uncertainty, other moments when the future seemed as fragile as morning mist, and yet she had continued to rise before dawn, to light the ovens, to feed the neighborhood with the same steady devotion that had sustained her family through generations of change. The memory of her grandmother's voice came to her now, soft and patient as it had been during those early morning lessons when Anna was still a child, learning to distinguish between the different stages of rising dough. Her grandmother had spoken of bread as if it were a living thing that required understanding rather than mere technique, as if the proper making of bread was a form of prayer that connected the baker to something larger than herself. Anna had not understood then what her grandmother meant when she spoke of listening to the dough, of feeling its needs through her fingertips, but now, after years of practice, she found herself inhabiting that same intuitive knowledge. The dough began to take on the smooth, elastic quality that signaled its readiness for the final rising, and Anna shaped it into the familiar rounds that would soon fill her shelves. Each loaf was formed with the same careful attention, the same unconscious artistry that transformed simple ingredients into sustenance. She did not hurry, though she could sense that dawn was approaching more quickly now, the eastern sky beginning to show the first pale suggestions of color. There was something important about maintaining the proper pace, about refusing to let external pressures disturb the ancient rhythm of her work. The scent of yeast and flour seemed to intensify in the growing warmth, creating an atmosphere that was both earthy and ethereal, grounding her in the physical reality of her craft, while connecting her to something timeless and universal. This was the smell of her childhood, the fragrance that had filled her dreams and shaped her understanding of what home meant. Even now, as a young woman responsible for maintaining the family tradition, she found comfort in breathing deeply of this familiar air, in allowing the scent to fill her lungs and remind her of who she was and where she belonged. The warmth from the banked coals in the oven began to spread through the small room, and Anna felt the familiar satisfaction of a morning ritual completed with proper attention and care. Soon she would light the fire fully, would slide the first loaves into the heat, would begin the final phase of the process that would bring her neighbors to her door with their coins and their familiar greetings. But for now, in these last moments of pre-dawn quiet, she allowed herself to stand still in the center of her domain, surrounded by the tools and ingredients of her trade, feeling the deep contentment that came from knowing her place in the world and fulfilling it with grace. The wooden shelves that lined the walls seemed to glow in the candlelight, their surfaces polished smooth by years of use and care. These shelves had held the bread that fed her neighborhood through feast days and fasting periods, through celebrations and sorrows, through all the ordinary days that made up the texture of community life. Anna ran her flour-dusted fingers along the familiar wood, feeling the slight depressions worn by countless loaves, the gentle curves that had been shaped by the weight of bread and the passage of time. The city beyond her walls was beginning to stir. She could sense it in the subtle changes in the quality of silence, the way the darkness seemed to be holding its breath in preparation for whatever the new day might bring. But here, in the sanctuary of her bakery, with flour dust settling like benediction on every surface and the promise of fresh bread filling the air, Anna felt herself anchored to something eternal and unchanging, something that would continue long after whatever storms were gathering had passed into memory. The gentle whisper of settling flour and the soft creak of warming wood created a peaceful backdrop that seemed to exist outside the concerns of the larger world, a cocoon of continuity that would shelter her and her neighbors through whatever changes might come. The Imperial Library existed in a pocket of eternal morning, where light filtered through tall windows to illuminate dust motes that danced like ancient spirits celebrating the preservation of knowledge. Maximos Planudes the younger sat at his accustomed place beside the window that overlooked the Bosphorus, his reed pen poised above parchment that seemed to glow with its own inner light in the gentle radiance of dawn. The chamber around him breathed with the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Leather-bound volumes lining shelves that stretched toward a ceiling painted with constellations that had guided scholars through countless nights of study and contemplation. The morning air carried with it the salt tang of the sea and something else, something that made the light seem more precious, more fragile than it had in years past. But Maximus chose to focus on the immediate task before him, the careful formation of each letter that would preserve for future generations the thoughts of Aristotle on the nature of virtue and the good life. His fingers, stained permanently with ink from 40 years of copying, moved with the deliberate precision of a craftsman who understood that his work was both humble and sacred, both routine and essential to the continuity of civilization itself. Each stroke of the pen was a small act of faith, a declaration that knowledge would survive whatever storms might come, that the careful preservation of wisdom was worth the aching back and failing eyesight that came with decades spent hunched over manuscripts. The parchment beneath his hand was smooth and cream-colored, made from the hide of lambs raised in monasteries where monks had spent generations perfecting the art of creating surfaces worthy of the greatest thoughts humanity had produced. The ink flowed from his pen like liquid midnight, forming letters that seemed to pulse with life in the shifting patterns of light and shadow that played across his work surface. The library held within its walls the whispered conversations of countless scholars who had worked in this same space, their voices seeming to echo still in the rustle of pages and the soft scratch of pen against parchment. Maximus could feel their presence as he worked, the ghostly company of men who had devoted their lives to the same sacred task of preservation and transmission. They had faced their own uncertainties, their own moments when the future seemed as distant and unknowable as the stars that wheeled overhead, and yet they had continued to copy and preserve, to maintain the fragile thread that connected past wisdom to future understanding. The particular manuscript he worked on today had come to him through a chain of transmission that stretched back nearly 2,000 years, each copy representing not just the preservation of text, but the devotion of individual scribes who had recognized the importance of these ideas. As he formed each word with painstaking care, Maximus found himself thinking about the monk in some distant monastery who had first copied these words from an even earlier source, about the care that anonymous scholar had taken to ensure that every letter was perfectly formed, every accent mark precisely placed. Through the window, the Bosphorus stretched like a ribbon of hammered silver, its surface broken by the passage of vessels that moved with purposes he chose not to contemplate. The water caught and reflected the morning light, breaking it into countless fragments that danced and scattered like the thoughts of philosophers across the ages. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of voices, the ordinary business of a city going about its morning routines, but these sounds seemed to reach him from very far away, as if the library existed in a different realm entirely, a place where time moved according to different laws. The manuscript he was copying dealt with questions that had occupied human minds for thousands of years, questions about the nature of happiness and the proper way to live a human life. As he formed each word with careful attention, Maximus found himself reflecting on the strange comfort that came from engaging with ideas that had survived the rise and fall of empires, thoughts that had been preserved through wars and plagues, and all the other catastrophes that marked the passage of human history. There was something deeply reassuring about the continuity of these questions, the way they remained relevant and urgent regardless of the particular circumstances that surrounded any individual scholar. The gentle sound of pages turning in other parts of the library created a soft percussion that underscored his work, the whisper of parchment against parchment, forming a kind of music that spoke of centuries of scholarly devotion. Occasionally, he could hear the distant murmur of voices as other scribes consulted with each other about particularly difficult passages or debated the proper interpretation of ambiguous phrases. These sounds were as familiar to him as his own breathing, the background symphony of intellectual life that had shaped his days for 4 decades. His eyesight was not what it had been in his youth, and he had to lean closer to the parchment now, squinting slightly to make out the fine details of each letter. But this physical limitation seemed almost irrelevant compared to the clarity of purpose that guided his work. Each manuscript he completed was a small victory against the forces of chaos and forgetting, a contribution to the great project of human understanding that stretched back to the earliest philosophers and forward to scholars not yet born. The slight tremor that had begun to affect his hands in recent months only made him more conscious of the preciousness of each perfectly formed letter, each successfully completed page. The morning light grew stronger as he worked, illuminating the careful rows of text that grew beneath his pen like a garden of words. The rhythm of his writing was meditative, almost hypnotic, each letter flowing into the next with the smooth inevitability of water finding its course down a mountainside. He did not hurry, understanding that the value of his work lay not in speed, but in accuracy, not in quantity, but in the faithful transmission of ideas that had shaped the minds of generations. The soft scratch of his pen against parchment became a kind of prayer, a meditation on the importance of preserving human wisdom for future generations. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Maximus paused occasionally to flex his fingers and rest his eyes, looking out at the water where morning light created patterns that shifted and changed, like the thoughts of philosophers across time. In these moments of rest, he felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing his place in the great chain of transmission that connected ancient wisdom to future understanding, the profound peace that came from serving something larger and more enduring than his own brief life. The library around him seemed to pulse with the accumulated energy of all the minds that had worked within its walls, all the thoughts that had been preserved and transmitted through the careful attention of scribes like himself. The very air seemed thick with the presence of ideas that had been copied and recopied, discussed and debated, preserved and passed on through the devoted labor of men who understood that civilization itself depended on their willingness to spend their lives in service to knowledge. In this atmosphere of scholarly devotion and intellectual continuity, Maximus found a peace that transcended whatever uncertainties might exist in the world beyond the library walls, a serenity that came from knowing that his work would outlast whatever storms might come. The modest house in the Fenar district held the morning like a cupped hand holds water, gentle and secure, with sunlight filtering through small windows to create pools of warmth on wooden floors worn smooth by the daily passage of small feet and careful mothers. Theodora Cantacuzenos moved through her morning ritual with the practiced grace of repetition made sacred by love, her hands working through her daughter's dark hair with the same patient attention she had given to this task every day for 2 years. The child's hair was soft and fine, catching the light like spun silk as Theodora divided it into sections and began the intricate braid that would keep it neat and beautiful throughout the day. The house around them breathed with the accumulated warmth of family life, the walls holding within them the echoes of laughter and tears, of bedtime stories and morning songs, of all the small dramas that made up the texture of domestic happiness. Maria, her daughter, chattered about a dream of golden birds that had visited her in the night, their wings making music like tiny bells as they danced around her bed. Theodora made the appropriate sounds of interest and wonder, her voice carrying the gentle attention that children require and deserve, while her mind moved through the practical calculations that would shape their day. Bread to be bought from Anna's bakery, water to be drawn from the cistern, the small tear in her son's tunic that needed mending before it grew larger. The morning light that entered through their eastern window carried with it the familiar sounds of the neighborhood awakening, the voices of women calling to each other across narrow streets, the clip of horse hooves on stone, the distant sound of merchants setting up their stalls in the marketplace. These were the sounds that had marked her mornings for years, the comfortable symphony of a community going about its daily business with the assumption that tomorrow would be much like today, that the patterns they had established would continue indefinitely into a future that seemed as solid and predictable as the stones beneath their feet. Her youngest son, Nikephoros, played on the floor beside her with carved wooden animals that his father had made before his death 2 years earlier. The child arranged and rearranged the tiny figures with the serious concentration that small children bring to their games, creating elaborate stories that existed entirely in his imagination, but seemed as real and important to him as any of the concerns that occupied the adult world. Watching him, Theodora felt the fierce protectiveness that had become the organizing principle of her life since her husband's death, the determination to preserve for her children this sense of security and normalcy, regardless of what uncertainties might be gathering beyond the walls of their home. The wooden animals her husband had carved were works of simple artistry, each one shaped with the care of a man who understood that the toys he made for his children would outlast his own presence in their lives. The little horse had a flowing mane that Nikephoros liked to stroke with his small fingers. The sheep bore the marks of careful attention to the texture of wool. The lion possessed a dignity that spoke of patient hours spent with knife and wood. These toys had become more precious to Theodora than any jewels, tangible reminders of her husband's love that would continue to bring comfort to their children long after the sharp edge of grief had softened into memory. The sewing basket sat open beside her, needle and thread, waiting for the attention she would give them once the children were properly dressed and fed. The small tear in Constantine's tunic was hardly noticeable, but she had learned from her own mother that such things were best addressed immediately before they had a chance to grow into larger problems. There was wisdom in this attention to small details, a kind of practical philosophy that recognized the importance of maintaining the fabric of daily life through careful attention to its minor needs and requirements. A pot of water simmered over the small fire, steam rising in gentle spirals that caught the morning light and disappeared into the warm air of the room. The fire itself was a source of comfort, its steady warmth and soft crackling providing a backdrop of security that made the house feel like a sanctuary from whatever concerns might exist in the larger world. Theodora had learned to find peace in these simple elements of domestic life, to see in the maintenance of her household a kind of sacred duty that connected her to all the mothers who had come before her and all who would come after. The rhythm of her morning routine had become a form of meditation, each task flowing naturally into the next, with the inevitability of seasons changing or tides turning. There was something deeply satisfying about the predictability of these rituals, the way they created a framework of stability that allowed her children to grow and flourish even in the absence of their father. As she worked, Theodora found herself thinking about her own mother, who had performed these same tasks with the same patient devotion, who had created for her own children the same sense of security and continuity that Theodora now struggled to maintain. As she finished Maria's braid and tied it with a ribbon that had belonged to her own mother, Theodora felt the deep satisfaction that came from completing a task with proper care and attention. The braid was perfect, each strand lying exactly where it should, the ribbon adding just the right touch of color and festivity to her daughter's appearance. These small acts of love and attention were what held the world together, she believed, what made it possible for children to grow up feeling secure and valued regardless of what storms might be gathering in the distance. The morning routine continued with the same gentle rhythm that had shaped their days for months, each task flowing naturally into the next, with the inevitability of water finding its course. Constantine needed help with the buttons on his shirt. Nikephoros required assistance in finding the wooden horse that had somehow wandered under the table during his play. These were the demands that filled Theodora's world, the immediate needs that required her attention and care, and she found in meeting them a kind of peace that made it possible to avoid thinking about the future that lay beyond the boundaries of this single day. The house itself seemed to participate in this morning ritual, the wooden floors creaking softly under their feet, the walls radiating the accumulated warmth of the fire, the very air seeming to hold and cherish the sounds of family life. Through the small windows, she could see other mothers beginning their own morning routines, hanging washing in small courtyards, calling to their children, going about the business of maintaining their households with the same quiet determination that had sustained women for generations. There was comfort in this sense of shared purpose, in knowing that she was part of a larger community of mothers, all working to create stability and love for their children. The gentle sounds of domestic life created a peaceful backdrop that seemed to exist outside the concerns of the larger world. The soft whisper of fabric against fabric as she folded clean clothes, the quiet murmur of children's voices as they played together, the distant sound of water being drawn from the neighborhood cistern. These sounds had become the music of her life, the familiar symphony that marked the passage of ordinary days and reminded her that happiness could be found in the simplest acts of care and attention. In this atmosphere of domestic tranquility, surrounded by the evidence of her love and labor, Theodora found a peace that transcended whatever uncertainties might exist beyond the walls of her home. The Church of Saints. Peter and Paul existed in a realm where time moved according to different laws, where the gentle flicker of candlelight against gold-leafed icons created the illusion of movement in painted faces that had watched over generations of worshippers. Father Gennadios Scholarios moved through his morning preparations with the slow grace of deep familiarity, each gesture carrying within it the accumulated weight of 30 years spent in service to the eternal rhythms of worship. The air around him was thick with frankincense and beeswax, with the lingering essence of countless prayers that seemed to have taken up permanent residence in the stone walls and wooden pews of his small parish church. The icons received his gentle attention one by one, each painted face cleaned with the same careful reverence he had learned from his predecessor. An old priest, whose name was carved in marble beside the altar, and whose presence seemed to linger still in the way morning light fell across the sanctuary. The Virgin held her child with the same serene expression she had worn for centuries, her painted eyes seeming to follow Father Gennadios as he moved about his tasks. St. Peter gazed out from his icon with the weathered face of a fisherman who had learned to navigate storms, both literal and metaphorical, while St. Paul carried in his painted features the intensity of a man who had been transformed by encounter with the divine. Each candle was lit with the same prayer his predecessor had taught him 3 decades ago, words that had been spoken in this same place by priests whose names were forgotten, but whose devotion lived on in the continuation of the ritual itself. The flames caught and held, casting dancing shadows against walls that had absorbed the hopes and fears of countless souls who had sought comfort in this sacred space. The church held their presence like incense holds fragrance, invisible but unmistakable, a communion of believers that stretched across time and connected the living with the dead, in bonds that transcended the boundaries of individual existence. The chalice reflected his face as he polished it with the soft cloth that had been blessed for this purpose, and Father Gennadios saw in that distorted image not himself, but all the priests who had performed this same ritual in this same place, their hands moving with the same careful attention, their hearts filled with the same mixture of humility and awe that came from handling objects dedicated to the mystery of divine presence. The silver surface held the light like captured prayer, throwing back reflections that seemed to multiply infinitely, creating a visual echo of the eternal nature of the service he was about to perform. Morning light filtered through stained glass windows that told stories of saints and martyrs, of ordinary people who had been transformed by their encounter with the sacred, and had in turn transformed the world around them through their witness and sacrifice. The colored patterns that fell across the worn marble floor seemed to pulse with life, creating a carpet of light that connected earth to heaven through the medium of human artistry dedicated to divine glory. The altar cloth, embroidered by women whose names were forgotten but whose devotion lived on in every careful stitch, caught the light like captured prayer, its golden threads seeming to glow with their own inner radiance. The stone walls of the church held within them the echo of 1,000 services, the accumulated resonance of voices raised in praise and petition, of children baptized and couples married, of funerals conducted and feast days celebrated. Father Gennadios could feel this history surrounding him as he prepared for the midday service. The ghostly presence of all who had worshipped in this space before him, and all who would continue to seek comfort here long after his own voice had joined the silent chorus of the departed. Outside, the sounds of the city seemed muffled, as if the church existed in a pocket of eternal time where the ordinary concerns of daily life could not penetrate. The voices of merchants and the clip of horse hooves, the laughter of children and the conversations of neighbors, all these reached him as if from a great distance, filtered through layers of prayer and contemplation that transformed them into something like music, a symphony of human life that provided a backdrop for the more profound harmonies that echoed within these sacred walls. As he arranged the elements for the Eucharist, Father Gennadios felt the deep peace that came from serving something larger than himself, something that had existed before his birth and would continue long after his death. The bread and wine waited on the altar with the patience of elements that had been transformed by centuries of blessing into vehicles for divine presence, their ordinary appearance concealing the extraordinary reality that faith revealed to those who approached them with proper reverence and understanding. He found himself remembering his first day in this church, how overwhelmed he had been by the responsibility of carrying forward traditions that stretched back through generations of faithful servants. The old priest had shown him how to hold his hands during the blessing, how to move through the sanctuary with proper reverence, how to listen for the voice of God in the silence between prayers. Those lessons had become second nature now, woven into the fabric of his being like the golden threads in the altar cloth, invisible but essential to the integrity of the whole. The morning air carried with it the faint salt tang of the Golden Horn, that ancient waterway that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the coming and going of countless souls who had sought meaning in the face of uncertainty. From his small window, Father Gennadios could see the water catching the early light, its surface broken by the gentle passage of fishing boats, whose owners he had blessed at the beginning of each season for as long as he could remember. Their quiet industry reminded him of the disciples, those simple men who had left their nets to follow a carpenter's son and had thereby changed the course of human history. The prayer book fell open in his hands to a passage he had read thousands of times, yet the words seemed fresh this morning, as if he were encountering them for the first time. This was the mystery of Scripture, he reflected, its ability to speak anew to each generation, to offer comfort and guidance that remained relevant across the centuries. The pages were worn soft from handling, their edges yellowed with age, and he could see in the margins the faint pencil marks left by his predecessor, notes and observations that had guided his own understanding in those early years of uncertainty. The sanctuary lamp burned with its eternal flame, a reminder of the continuous nature of divine presence that neither slept nor rested, but remained constant through all the changes and chances of mortal life. Father Gennadios had tended this flame for 3 decades, ensuring that it never went out, that its light continued to shine as a beacon of hope for all who entered this sacred space seeking solace or direction. The oil that fed the flame was blessed each week, transformed from ordinary substance into something that participated in the divine economy of grace and redemption. As he prepared the altar for the service to come, Father Gennadios reflected on the countless hands that had touched these same objects, the unbroken chain of faith that connected him to the apostles themselves through the laying on of hands that had been passed down through 2 millennia of faithful service. The weight of this tradition was not a burden, but a comfort, a reminder that he was part of something far greater than his individual life, something that would continue long after his own earthly service had ended. The church bells began their gentle call to worship, their bronze voices carrying across the narrow streets and into the homes of his parishioners, summoning them to this weekly gathering that had sustained their community through wars and plagues, through times of prosperity and seasons of want. Father Gennadios listened to their familiar song and felt his heart lift with anticipation, knowing that soon these empty pews would fill with the faces he had come to love, each one carrying their own burdens and hopes, their own need for the peace that only faith could provide. The afternoon light filtered through the wooden slats of the market roof in patterns that Constantine Lascaris had watched shift across his counter for 23 years. Each beam fell differently as the sun moved westward, creating pools of golden warmth that transformed the bolts of silk into rivers of color. The crimson damask caught the light and held it, deep as wine, while the azure silk seemed to breathe with each subtle movement of air through the covered passages. Here in this familiar sanctuary of commerce, surrounded by the gentle murmur of voices that echoed softly off stone walls, Constantine found himself performing the same ritual his father had taught him decades ago, running silk through his fingers to feel for the quality that only touch could reveal. The voices of merchants and customers blended into a continuous backdrop of human presence, punctuated by the soft shuffle of feet on worn stones and the rustle of fabric being examined. 3 languages mingled in the air around him, Greek and Latin, and the newer sounds that had crept into the city's daily speech, creating a tapestry of sound as complex as the textiles that surrounded him. The scent of fine silk filled his nostrils, clean and slightly sweet, mixing with the earthier smells of leather from the cobbler's stall nearby and the sharp tang of spices from the merchants who dealt in treasures from distant lands. This was the world he had known since childhood, when his father would lift him to see over the counter and teach him to distinguish between silk that would last generations and fabric that would fade with the first washing. His hands moved with unconscious expertise over a bolt of deep purple silk, fingers reading the weave like a familiar text. The dye had been achieved through months of careful work, each thread soaked and dried and soaked again until it held the color that emperors had once reserved for their own garments. Constantine's fingertips, permanently stained with traces of indigo and madder root, could detect the finest variations in texture, the subtle differences that meant the difference between silk that would bring pride to its wearer and silk that would disappoint. But today, as the light continued its ancient dance across his wares, something felt different about this daily examination. The recognition came slowly, like the gradual brightening of dawn over the Bosphorus. As he lifted a length of gold-threaded brocade to catch the light, Constantine found himself truly seeing it for perhaps the first time in years. The gold thread had cost more than most men earned in a year, each strand carefully beaten and wound by craftsmen whose skills had been passed down through generations. The pattern woven into the silk told stories of peacocks and flowering vines, of a world where beauty was created not for immediate profit, but for the joy of creating something that would outlast its makers. When had he last noticed these stories hidden in the weave? When had he stopped seeing the miracle of transformation that turned cocoons and metal into something that could make a woman feel like an empress? The afternoon air moved gently through the market passages, carrying with it the accumulated scents and sounds of 8 centuries of commerce. Constantine's wooden counter, worn smooth by countless transactions, bore the subtle impressions of elbows and hands, the marks of 1,000 negotiations conducted in the spirit of mutual respect that had made this market a place where Christians and others could trade in peace. The stone walls around him had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the coming and going of merchants from lands so distant their names sounded like poetry. In this atmosphere of continuity and permanence, Constantine had built his life one careful transaction at a time. But now, as he arranged his finest silks in the fading light, a different awareness began to settle over him like dust. The voices around him seemed to carry undertones he had not noticed before, conversations that stopped abruptly when he drew near, glances exchanged between customers who had been friends for years. The very air seemed charged with something unspoken, a tension that made even familiar gestures feel weighted with significance. Constantine found himself looking at each bolt of silk not just as merchandise, but as a repository of memory, each piece connected to the craftsman who had woven it, the customer who had bought it, the occasions for which it had been worn. The deep crimson damask had been purchased by Maria Paleologos for her daughter's wedding 3 summers ago. Constantine remembered the careful way she had examined each fold, the pride in her voice as she described the ceremony that would unite 2 old families. The azure silk had been chosen by the merchant Georgios for his wife's Easter gown, selected not for its cost, but for the way it matched her eyes when she smiled. Each piece carried with it a fragment of the life that flowed through this market, the hopes and celebrations that gave meaning to the careful work of weavers and dyers and merchants who understood that beauty was not a luxury, but a necessity of the human spirit. As the light began to shift toward evening, Constantine found himself cataloging these memories with unusual precision. The way his father had taught him to hold silk up to the light to check for flaws, turning it slowly until every thread had been examined. The satisfaction of matching a customer with exactly the right fabric for their needs, seeing their face transform when they touched silk that spoke to something deep within them. The quiet pride of maintaining standards that had made his family's name synonymous with quality for 3 generations. These moments, accumulated over decades of patient work, suddenly felt precious in a way they had not before. The realization settled over him gradually, like evening shadows creeping across the market floor. This world he had known since childhood, this intricate web of relationships and traditions that had seemed as permanent as the stones beneath his feet, was perhaps more fragile than he had ever imagined. The conversations that stopped when he approached, the worried looks exchanged between merchants who had weathered countless crises together, the subtle changes in the rhythm of daily life that he had attributed to the ordinary fluctuations of commerce, all began to form a pattern that his mind had been reluctant to acknowledge. Constantine's hands stilled on a length of silk that caught the last rays of afternoon sun like captured fire. In the gentle murmur of voices that continued around him, in the familiar sense of fabric and spice and human presence, he began to understand that he might be witnessing the end of something that had endured for centuries. This market, these relationships, this way of life that had shaped him and given meaning to his days, might soon exist only in memory. The recognition brought with it not panic, but a strange peace, as if he had been given the gift of seeing clearly for the first time in years. He folded the silk carefully, his movements deliberate and reverent. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring, but today he could still run his fingers over fabric that represented the accumulated skill of generations, could still breathe air scented with the familiar perfumes of his trade, could still participate in the ancient dance of commerce that had made this corner of the world a place where beauty and necessity met in perfect harmony. In this moment of recognition, Constantine found himself grateful for every ordinary day he had been given in this extraordinary place, every routine transaction that had woven him into the larger tapestry of the city's life. Maximus moved through the scriptorium with the careful deliberation of one who had spent 40 years among fragile things. The candle in his hand cast shifting shadows across stone walls lined with wooden shelves, each shelf bearing the weight of centuries. His failing eyesight had taught him new ways of seeing, new methods of understanding the treasures that surrounded him in this sacred space. He set the candle in its holder and reached for a manuscript bound in leather, so old it felt like silk beneath his fingertips. The parchment within whispered as he opened it, a sound that spoke of monks bent over writing desks, of scholars debating in courtyards, of students copying texts by lamplight. Each page held not merely words but the breath of those who had created it, preserved it, loved it enough to ensure its survival. The weight of the book in his hands told him stories his eyes could no longer read clearly. This particular volume, he knew without looking at the title, contained the mathematical treatises of ancient Alexandria. He could feel the precision in the binding, the care taken in the copying, the reverence of the monk who had illuminated its margins with gold leaf that still caught the candlelight after 3 centuries. Dust motes drifted lazily through the golden pools of light, settling on surfaces worn smooth by countless hands like his own. The monastery's thick walls muffled all sound except the whisper of turning pages and the soft crackle of candle wicks. Here, in this chamber that smelled of old parchment and beeswax, time moved differently. Past and present converged in the space between his fingers and the ancient paper. He moved to another shelf, his hand finding a collection of Aristotelian commentaries. The binding was looser here, more fragile, requiring the gentlest touch. As he opened it, he remembered the young monk who had brought this very book to him 20 years ago, eager to discuss a particular passage about the nature of change. That monk was gone now, taken by fever the previous winter, but his questions lived on in the margins of this text, penciled notes that had become part of the manuscript's continuing conversation. The candlelight flickered across ancient Greek letters, each one formed with the deliberate care of scribes who understood they were preserving more than words. They were maintaining a conversation that stretched across centuries, connecting minds that had never met in life, but met constantly in the realm of ideas. Maximus traced the edge of a page with one finger, feeling the slight roughness where the scribe's pen had pressed perhaps too firmly, leaving a tiny furrow in the parchment. He discovered in this gentle exploration that his hands had learned to read in ways his eyes no longer could. The texture of different papers told him their age, their origin, the conditions under which they had been stored. Vellum felt different from paper made of rags, and both felt different from the precious purple parchment reserved for imperial documents. Each surface held its own history, its own story of creation and preservation. A manuscript of Plato's dialogues lay open on a reading stand, its pages yellow with age but still perfectly legible. The scribe who had copied this particular text had possessed exceptional skill. Each letter was formed with mathematical precision, each line spaced with perfect consistency. Maximus could feel the scribe's personality in the work, the quiet pride taken in creating something beautiful as well as functional. The night air moved softly through the chamber, stirring lightweight pages that rustled like whispered conversations. He thought of all the scholars who had sat in this very room, reading these same texts, adding their own insights to the margins, continuing discussions that had begun in Athens and Alexandria, and would continue, he hoped, long after Constantinople itself had changed beyond recognition. He lifted a particularly heavy volume, a complete copy of the Iliad transcribed with elaborate illuminations. The weight of it spoke to him of the monk who had devoted 3 years of his life to its creation, working by candlelight just as Maximos worked now, understanding that he was not merely copying words, but preserving the dreams and struggles of humanity itself. The gold leaf in the illuminated letters still gleamed, catching and holding the candlelight as if the manuscript itself were a source of illumination. In the gentle dance of light and shadow across the ancient texts, Maximos found himself understanding something he had never quite grasped before. His life's work had not been about saving books from destruction, though that was important. It had been about maintaining continuity, about ensuring that the conversations begun by ancient minds could continue in future ones. Each manuscript he preserved was a bridge across time, connecting past wisdom with future understanding. He opened a collection of Byzantine hymns, their musical notation still clear despite centuries of handling. The parchment here was particularly fine, almost translucent, and he could feel the care that had gone into its preparation. Someone had loved these hymns enough to ensure they would survive, understanding that music, like mathematics and philosophy, transcended the particular circumstances of its creation. The candle burned lower, its wax pooling in the holder, but Maximos felt no urgency. Time, in this chamber surrounded by the thoughts of centuries, moved according to different laws. He was participating in something larger than the particular moment, larger than the particular crisis that had brought him to this night of careful examination and gentle recognition. He closed his eyes and let his hands rest on the open pages before him. The parchment was warm from the candlelight, smooth beneath his palms. In that touch, he felt connected not only to the text itself, but to all the hands that had touched it before his own. Scribes and scholars, monks and students, each had left something of themselves in the handling, each had participated in the ongoing life of the ideas contained within these fragile pages. When he opened his eyes again, the candlelight seemed brighter, more golden. The manuscripts around him no longer appeared as objects to be preserved, but as living things, continuing their ancient conversations in the quiet of the night. His role, he understood now, was not that of a guardian protecting treasures from harm, but of a participant in an ongoing dialogue, ensuring that voices from the past could continue speaking to minds not yet born. The weight of parchment in his hands had become the weight of continuity itself, the physical manifestation of humanity's refusal to let wisdom die with those who first discovered it. In this recognition, Maximos found not the sadness of endings, but the quiet joy of participation in something eternal, something that would continue long after his own hands could no longer turn these precious pages. A treatise on astronomy caught his attention, its diagrams of celestial movements drawn with compass and straightedge by a monk who had understood that the stars themselves were part of the divine conversation. The ink had faded to a warm brown, but the precision of the geometric forms remained perfect. Each circle and arc a testament to the mathematical harmony that governed both earthly and heavenly realms. As Maximos studied the diagrams with his fingertips, feeling the slight indentations where the compass point had marked the parchment, he marveled at how knowledge of the heavens had been preserved through such humble materials, through the patient work of human hands guided by curious minds. The monastery's bell tower stood silent in the distance, its bronze voice stilled for the night, but Maximus could almost hear the echo of all the hours it had marked, all the prayers it had called the faithful to observe. Time here was measured not only by the movement of sun and stars, but by the turning of pages, the completion of copying tasks, the gradual accumulation of wisdom through generations of devoted scholarship. He found himself drawn to a collection of letters between scholars, personal correspondence that had somehow survived the centuries to become part of the monastery's collection. These intimate documents revealed the human side of learning, the friendships formed through shared intellectual passion, the debates that continued across vast distances through carefully crafted arguments preserved in elegant handwriting. Reading these letters, even with his failing sight, Maximus felt the presence of the writers as clearly as if they sat beside him in the candle-lit chamber, their voices continuing conversations that death had interrupted but not ended. Theodora moved through her late husband's workshop like a woman walking through a dream that had become more real than waking life. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, transforming the familiar space into something magical, casting silver patterns across bolts of silk arranged on wooden shelves. Each fabric caught and held the light differently, some shimmering like water, others glowing with deep, rich colors that seemed to breathe in the gentle illumination. She reached for a sample of burgundy silk, its surface so fine it seemed to flow like liquid between her fingers. This particular piece, she remembered, had been his favorite for autumn garments. He had held it up to the light just as she was doing now, explaining how the weave created subtle variations in color that changed with the angle of observation. His voice seemed to echo in the quiet workshop, not as memory, but as present reality, as if the silk itself held the sound of his words. The workshop smelled of fine fabric and the faint trace of his presence, a mixture of sandalwood and the particular scent that clung to silk when it had been handled with love and expertise. Wooden tools lay arranged on the work table exactly as he had left them, their surfaces worn smooth by familiar hands. She touched the edge of his cutting shears, feeling the slight indentations where his fingers had rested during countless hours of careful work. A bolt of emerald green silk caught her attention, its color so vivid it seemed to generate its own light. She remembered the day he had acquired this particular fabric, how excited he had been about its quality, the way he had immediately begun sketching designs that would showcase its beauty. His drawings still lay scattered across the table, precise lines indicating where each cut should be made, where each fold should fall. As she touched the silk, something unexpected happened. Instead of the sharp pain of loss she had grown accustomed to, she felt a quiet communion with his memory. The fabric seemed to hold not just his touch, but his understanding, his appreciation for beauty, his knowledge of how different weaves would drape and move. It was as if his expertise had become part of the silk itself, waiting for her to discover it. She moved to another shelf where lighter fabrics were stored. A bolt of cream-colored silk so fine it was nearly transparent caught the moonlight and threw it back in soft, diffused patterns. This had been destined for a wedding dress, she remembered, commissioned by a young woman whose marriage would now never take place, whose future had been altered by the same forces that had taken her husband. Yet the silk remained beautiful, unchanged by the circumstances that had prevented its intended use. The night air moved softly through the space, stirring lightweight silks that fluttered like whispered conversations. Theodora found herself able to distinguish between the fabrics he had loved most and those he had merely tolerated, as if his preferences had become part of her own understanding. A particular shade of blue silk felt somehow reluctant under her fingers, and she remembered how he had struggled with this color, never quite satisfied with the way it worked with his designs. But a nearby bolt of deep purple silk seemed to welcome her touch, its surface warm and responsive. This had been silk he had treasured, she realized, fabric he had saved for special commissions, for clients who would appreciate its exceptional quality. She could feel his satisfaction in the weave, his pleasure in working with material that responded so perfectly to his vision. Moonlight continued to stream through the windows, casting shifting patterns as clouds moved across the sky. The workshop felt both empty and full, quiet yet resonant with the memory of daily work. She could almost hear the sound of his shears cutting through fabric, the whisper of silk sliding across the work table, the soft murmur of his voice as he explained techniques to apprentices who would now never complete their training. She opened a wooden box that contained his most precious samples, small squares of silk so fine they seemed to float in her palm. Each piece represented months of searching, negotiating with merchants, evaluating quality with the trained eye of someone who understood that true beauty lay not just in appearance, but in the integrity of the weave itself. These samples were his vocabulary, the materials from which he had composed his designs. As she held each piece up to the moonlight, she began to understand something she had never quite grasped during his lifetime. His work had not been simply about creating beautiful garments, though he had certainly done that. It had been about understanding the nature of beauty itself, about finding ways to enhance the natural qualities of fine materials rather than imposing artificial decoration upon them. A length of silver silk seemed to capture and hold the moonlight, creating an effect so beautiful it took her breath away. She remembered watching him work with similar fabric, the patience he had shown in allowing the silk to reveal its own possibilities rather than forcing it into predetermined shapes. His hands had moved across the fabric with the reverence of someone who understood he was working with something precious, something that deserved his complete attention and respect. The realization came to her gradually, like dawn breaking slowly across the workshop. Her husband's presence had not disappeared with his death, but had transformed, becoming part of the beauty he had created, woven into the very fabric of his work. Every piece of silk in this room held some part of his understanding, some fragment of his appreciation for quality and craftsmanship. She found herself touching the fabrics, not with the desperate grasp of someone trying to hold on to something that was disappearing, but with the gentle appreciation of someone who had learned to recognize love in its transformed state. The silk responded to her touch differently now, as if it recognized in her hands some echo of his own reverence for fine materials. A bolt of midnight blue silk seemed to pulse with its own inner light, and she remembered the evening dress he had created from similar fabric, how the wearer had seemed to move through shadows and moonlight with equal grace. The memory brought not pain but a quiet satisfaction, an understanding that such beauty, once created, became permanent in ways that transcended the particular circumstances of its making. The workshop around her seemed to expand in the moonlight, becoming not just a place where work had been done, but a repository of understanding, a space where the appreciation of beauty had been cultivated and refined over years of patient practice. She could feel the weight of that accumulated knowledge, not as burden, but as gift, something that had been left for her to discover and perhaps to continue. As she carefully returned each sample to its proper place, Theodora understood that grief had not been conquered, but transformed, becoming not an ending, but a different way of loving. Her husband's presence lived on in the beauty he had created, in the standards he had maintained, in the reverence for fine craftsmanship he had demonstrated every day of their life together. The silk would remember his touch long after her own hands had forgotten how to feel its particular textures, ensuring that his understanding of beauty would continue to exist in the world he had helped to make more beautiful. Father Gennadios moved through the sanctuary with the fluid grace of decades of practice, but tonight each gesture carried the weight of finality and the lightness of perfect understanding. Oil lamps burned with steady golden flames before painted icons whose faces seemed to glow with inner light, their eyes following his careful movements as he prepared for what might be the final divine liturgy this ancient church would witness. He began with the altar cloth, unfolding it with the same precise movements he had performed thousands of times before. But tonight, as his hands smoothed the fabric across the altar's marble surface, he felt the action itself become prayer. The way his fingers traced the embroidered cross at the cloth's center, the gentle pressure he applied to ensure every wrinkle was removed, the care he took to align the edges perfectly with the altar's dimensions. All of this had become a form of conversation with mystery, a dialogue conducted not through words, but through devoted attention to sacred tasks. The iconostasis rose before him in the lamplight, its gold leaf catching and multiplying the warm illumination until the painted saints seemed to breathe with life. The air was heavy with the scent of olive oil and beeswax, mixed with the lingering fragrance of incense from evening prayers. Stone floors worn smooth by generations of worshippers reflected the gentle light, creating a sense of continuity that stretched back through centuries of faithful service. He lifted the chalice from its resting place, cradling it in his hands with the reverence due to something that had held the mystery of transformation countless times. The silver had been worn smooth by the touch of many priests, each of whom had brought their own understanding to this same ritual of preparation. As he polished the cup's surface with a soft cloth, Father Gennadios realized that this simple act of cleaning had become, over the years, a form of meditation, a way of preparing not just the vessel, but his own heart for the sacred work ahead. The precise placement of each sacred object on the altar had become second nature to him, yet tonight he found himself conscious of every movement, aware that each position had been determined by centuries of liturgical tradition. The paten beside the chalice, the spoon for distributing communion, the small pieces of linen that would cover the sacred elements. Each item had its proper place, its specific role in the ancient drama of worship that would unfold in the morning. He moved to trim the wicks of the oil lamps, a task that required the gentlest touch to avoid extinguishing the flames. As he worked, adjusting each wick to ensure a steady, clean burn, he understood that this too had become prayer, a way of tending the light that represented the presence of the divine in this sacred space. The flames responded to his care, burning brighter and more steadily, casting warmer light across the painted faces of saints who had watched over this congregation for generations. The sanctuary felt both intimate and vast, enclosed by ancient walls, yet open to something infinite. Shadows danced softly across painted scenes of biblical stories, across faces of martyrs and theologians whose lives had been devoted to understanding and serving the same mystery he served now. In their painted eyes, he saw not judgment, but companionship, the recognition of one servant by others who had walked the same path of devotion. As he arranged the liturgical books on their stand, opening to the proper pages for tomorrow's service, Father Gennadios felt the weight of all the words that had been spoken in this place. Prayers of thanksgiving and petition, confessions whispered in darkness, hymns sung by voices now silent. All of it seemed to resonate in the stone walls, creating a continuous chorus of worship that his own voice would join in the morning. The incense burner required careful attention, its chains needing adjustment to ensure it would swing properly during the service. As he tested its movement, the gentle clink of chain links created a sound that seemed to echo through time, connecting this moment with countless other moments when other priests had made the same preparations, performed the same careful adjustments, ensured that every detail was perfect for the sacred work ahead. He paused before the icon of Christ Pantocrator, its ancient face painted with such skill that the eyes seemed to hold depths of compassion and understanding that changed with the quality of light falling across them. This icon had presided over the sanctuary for 3 centuries, witnessing the prayers and struggles of countless faithful souls. Tonight, in the steady glow of the oil lamps, those painted eyes seemed to hold not sorrow for what was ending, but peace at what was being fulfilled. The realization came to him as he folded the communion cloths with precise, practiced movements. His entire priesthood had been preparation for this moment of understanding, this recognition that the sacred was not found in grand theological insights, but in the patient repetition of simple tasks performed with complete attention and love. Every time he had cleaned the chalice, trimmed a lamp wick, arranged the altar cloths, he had been participating in a form of prayer he had never fully recognized. The wooden altar rail, polished smooth by the hands of communicants over generations, caught the lamplight and seemed to glow with its own warmth. He ran his hand along its surface, feeling the slight depressions where countless elbows had rested, where people had knelt to receive the mystery he had offered them. Each mark in the wood represented a moment of encounter between human need and divine grace, a transaction in which he had been privileged to serve as intermediary. As he made his final adjustments to the arrangement of the sanctuary, Father Gennadios understood that ritual itself was prayer, that the careful performance of these ancient actions created a space where the divine and human could meet. The precision required in the placement of each object, the attention demanded by each small task, the reverence expressed through perfect execution of familiar movements, all of this constituted a form of worship that transcended words, a conversation with mystery conducted through devoted service. The oil lamps burned with unwavering flames, their light steady and warm. The icons gazed down with painted eyes that seemed to hold all the compassion and understanding accumulated over centuries of faithful witness. The altar stood ready, every element in its proper place, prepared for the sacred drama that would unfold with the dawn. In this moment of completion, surrounded by the fruits of his careful preparation, Father Gennadios felt not the weight of ending, but the lightness of perfect fulfillment. His hands, trained by decades of practice to perform these tasks with unconscious precision, had become instruments of prayer. His entire ministry, he now understood, had been a single, extended conversation with the divine, conducted not through eloquent sermons or profound theological insights, but through the faithful performance of simple, sacred tasks, each one offered with the complete attention that transformed ordinary actions into acts of worship. The marble floor beneath his feet held the warmth of the day, released now in the cool of evening like a gentle blessing. He knelt before the altar, not in formal prayer, but in simple recognition of what this space had meant to him, what it had taught him about the nature of service and devotion. The stone was smooth against his knees, worn by countless others who had knelt in this same spot, each bringing their own burdens and hopes to this place of encounter. As he rose, his movements slow and deliberate, Father Gennadios felt the presence of all those who had served before him in this sanctuary. Their devotion seemed to linger in the air like incense, their careful attention to these same tasks creating a continuity that transcended individual lifetimes. He was part of something larger than himself, part of a tradition of service that would continue even when his own hands could no longer perform these gentle ministrations. The night air moved softly through the sanctuary, stirring the flames of the oil lamps but never extinguishing them. In that gentle movement, in the steady burn of the flames, in the patient gaze of painted saints, Father Gennadios found a peace that spoke not of endings, but of completion, not of loss, but of fulfillment. His work here was finished, but the work itself would continue, carried forward by other hands, other hearts, other souls called to serve the mystery that dwelt in this sacred space. Anna sat in the cooling bakery, her hands finally still after years of constant motion. The ovens radiated their last warmth into the darkness, brick and stone releasing the day's accumulated heat with soft, settling sounds that spoke of work completed, of cycles fulfilled. Flour dust hung faintly in the air, visible in the pale moonlight that filtered through small windows, creating an atmosphere of gentle suspension, as if time itself had paused to allow for contemplation. Her palms rested upward in her lap, and she studied them in the dim light, hands marked by decades of kneading, shaping, tending. The calluses that had formed over years of working with dough were like medals of service, each one earned through countless mornings that had begun before dawn, countless loaves that had emerged golden and fragrant from the ovens that now rested in darkness beside her. The wooden tables bore the marks of her labor, their surfaces worn smooth and soft by the rhythm of kneading that had marked her days since childhood. She could trace the patterns her hands had worn into the wood, depressions created by the daily pressure of palms against dough, grooves carved by the edge of her baker's scraper as she had cleaned the surfaces after each day's work. These marks were a record of her life, a testament written in wood and ware to the constancy of her devotion. Flour dust settled on everything in the bakery like a benediction, coating surfaces with the finest layer of the grain that had been the foundation of her work. She breathed it in, this familiar scent that had been the constant companion of her days, and found in it not just the smell of her trade, but the essence of nourishment itself, the basic element from which she had created sustenance for her community. The scent of baked bread lingered in the air, mixed with the earthy smell of flour and the faint sweetness of yeast that had worked its ancient magic in countless batches of dough. These smells were more than memories. They were the atmosphere of her life, the olfactory signature of work that had connected her to the most fundamental human needs: hunger, nourishment, the simple satisfaction of bread broken and shared. Tools hung in their familiar places around the bakery, wooden peels shaped by use into perfect function, measuring cups worn smooth by her hands, mixing bowls that had held thousands of batches of dough. Each implement had been shaped by her touch, adapted to her particular way of working, until they had become extensions of her own body, instruments through which she had expressed her understanding of the ancient craft she had inherited. She contemplated the rhythm that had governed her life, the daily cycle of mixing, kneading, rising, baking, that had marked her days with the regularity of prayer. Each morning had begun the same way, with the lighting of the ovens, the measuring of ingredients, the first touch of her hands to flour and water that would be transformed through her labor and the mystery of fermentation into the bread that would sustain her neighbors through another day. The kneading had been meditation, she realized now, though she had never thought of it in those terms. The repetitive motion of her hands working the dough, the gradual transformation of separate ingredients into a unified mass, the way the dough responded to her touch, becoming smoother and more elastic under her palms. All of this had been a form of prayer, a conversation between her hands and the ancient processes that turned grain into sustenance. She remembered the feel of properly kneaded dough, the way it would spring back when pressed, the smooth surface that indicated the gluten had developed correctly, the slight warmth that meant the yeast was beginning its work. These sensations had been her vocabulary, the language through which she had communicated with the living processes that were the foundation of her craft. The rising had taught her patience. The way dough needed time to develop could not be hurried beyond its natural pace. She had learned to read the signs that indicated proper fermentation, the way the surface would dome slightly, the particular smell that meant the yeast was healthy and active, the gentle resistance when she pressed the dough with her finger to test its readiness. This had been education in the rhythms of life itself, lessons in timing and patience that had shaped her understanding far beyond the bakery. The moment of sliding loaves into the hot ovens had always carried a sense of offering, of presenting the work of her hands to the transforming fire that would complete the process she had begun. The heat had been her partner in creation, turning pale dough into golden bread, creating the crust that would protect the soft interior, developing the flavors that would nourish both body and spirit. She had learned to judge doneness by sound, the hollow thump when a loaf was tapped on its bottom, the particular way the crust would crackle as it cooled, the subtle changes in the bread's appearance that indicated perfect baking. These had been the skills that connected her to generations of bakers who had learned the same lessons, developed the same instincts, served the same fundamental human need. The cooling bread had filled the bakery with its fragrance each day, a smell that drew neighbors and strangers alike, that spoke of home and comfort and the basic satisfaction of needs met. She had seen how people's faces changed when they entered the bakery, how the scent of fresh bread seemed to awaken something primal and peaceful in them, connecting them to memories of their own kitchens, their own families, their own experiences of being nourished. Sitting now in the quiet darkness, Anna understood that her life had been measured not in grand events, but in this daily rhythm of service, this constant offering of nourishment to her community. The flour dust on her hands felt like a blessing, the calluses on her palms like marks of devotion earned through decades of faithful work. The bakery around her seemed both empty and full, quiet yet resonant with the memory of all the work that had been accomplished within its walls. The space held the echo of countless mornings, the residue of thousands of loaves, the accumulated satisfaction of a life spent in service to the most basic human needs. She realized that her work had been a form of participation in something larger than herself, a way of contributing to the continuity of life in her community. Every loaf she had baked had been an act of faith, faith that there would be another day, another need for bread, another opportunity to transform simple ingredients into sustenance. This faith had sustained her through years of early mornings and tired evenings, through the physical demands of her trade and the constant responsibility of feeding others. The recognition came to her like the gradual lightening of dawn. Her life had been a prayer offered in flour and yeast, a devotion expressed through the patient repetition of ancient tasks. She had been a keeper of traditions that stretched back to the beginning of civilization, a guardian of knowledge that connected her to every baker who had ever kneaded dough or tended ovens or offered bread to hungry neighbors. In the gentle darkness of the cooling bakery, surrounded by the tools and surfaces that had shaped her days, Anna felt not the sadness of endings, but the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, a service faithfully rendered, a calling completely fulfilled. The warehouse held the accumulated silence of years, broken only by the soft whisper of Constantine's footsteps against the wooden floor. Moonlight streamed through the high windows, transforming the space into something approaching a cathedral, each bolt of silk catching and holding the pale light like captured prayers. He moved slowly between the towering rows, his fingers trailing along fabrics that represented decades of careful selection, each piece a testament to beauty preserved against time's erosion. The silk from Damascus caught his attention first, its deep crimson surface seeming to pulse with inner warmth even in the cool night air. He remembered the merchant who had brought it, a man whose eyes had held the same reverence for beauty that Constantine recognized in himself. The transaction had been more than commerce. It had been the passing of something sacred from one guardian to another. His fingers found the edge of the bolt, feeling the weight of silk that had been spun by creatures smaller than his fingernail, yet capable of creating something that would outlast empires. Beside the Damascus silk lay a bolt of pale gold from Byzantium's own workshops, woven by hands that had learned their craft from masters whose names were lost to time. Constantine pulled a length free, watching as it caught the moonlight and threw it back in ripples of captured sunshine. The pattern was subtle, visible only when the light struck it at precisely the right angle, a hidden beauty that revealed itself only to those who took time to truly see. This, he understood now, had been his gift, not merely the ability to recognize quality, but the patience to wait for beauty to reveal itself fully. The Chinese silk occupied the far corner of the warehouse, its midnight blue surface scattered with silver threads that traced the outline of cranes in flight. Constantine had paid more for this single bolt than most men earned in a year, yet as he stood before it now, he felt only gratitude for having been able to preserve such artistry. The silk had traveled thousands of miles, carried by merchants who understood that some things transcended mere profit, that beauty itself was a form of currency that enriched all who handled it. The cranes seemed to move in the shifting light, their silver wings catching moonbeams as if preparing for actual flight. Memory brought him to the day he had first entered this warehouse as a young man, overwhelmed by the sheer abundance of beauty that surrounded him. His father had walked these same aisles, teaching him to distinguish between silk that merely pleased the eye and silk that spoke to something deeper in the human soul. The lesson had taken years to fully understand, that true beauty was not about perfection, but about the marriage between human skill and natural wonder, the collaboration between the silkworm's instinctive spinning and the weaver's learned artistry. He paused before a bolt of pale green silk, its surface marked with the subtle irregularities that revealed its handmade nature. A machine might have produced something more uniform, more technically perfect, but it could never have created the small variations that made this fabric alive, that gave it the quality of breathing even in stillness. Constantine realized that his entire life had been spent in service to this principle, that imperfection in the service of beauty was more valuable than perfection that lacked soul. The warehouse around him held more than fabric. It held the dreams and aspirations of countless artisans who had poured their skill into creating something that would outlast their own brief lives. Each bolt represented not just the final product, but the entire chain of creation that had brought it into being. The farmers who had tended the mulberry trees, the workers who had cared for the silk worms, the spinners who had drawn thread from cocoons, the dyers who had mixed colors that captured the essence of sunset and storm, the weavers whose hands had guided each thread into patterns that spoke of order emerging from chaos. Moonlight shifted across the warehouse floor as clouds moved across the night sky, and Constantine found himself thinking of the merchants who would never come again, the trade routes that were closing even as he stood among his treasures. The world was changing in ways that would make his kind of commerce impossible, yet he felt no bitterness about this transformation. Beauty, he understood now, was not diminished by scarcity. If anything, it became more precious when threatened with extinction. He moved deeper into the warehouse, where the most precious pieces were stored in cedar chests that released their aromatic breath each time they were opened. The silk within these chests represented the pinnacle of human achievement in the marriage of craft and artistry. Some pieces were so delicate they could barely support their own weight, yet they had survived journeys across continents and decades of careful storage. Constantine lifted a length of ivory silk embroidered with threads of actual gold, feeling its weight in his hands like a prayer made tangible. The embroidery depicted a garden where every flower was rendered with such precision that he could identify each species, yet the overall effect was not of botanical accuracy, but of paradise itself. The artisan who had created this masterpiece had understood that true art lay not in copying nature, but in distilling its essence, in creating something that was more beautiful than reality while remaining absolutely faithful to its spirit. Constantine had spent his life learning to recognize such transcendence, developing an eye that could distinguish between mere skill and actual genius. As he returned the precious silk to its resting place, Constantine felt the weight of responsibility that had shaped his entire adult life. He had been more than a merchant. He had been a curator of human achievement, a guardian of beauty in a world that often seemed determined to destroy what it could not understand. Every transaction had been an act of preservation, every sale a careful placement of beauty into hands that would value and protect it. The warehouse held other treasures, silks from India whose colors seemed to contain captured sunlight, Persian fabrics whose patterns told stories older than written history, Byzantine weaves whose complexity spoke of a civilization at its artistic peak. Each piece represented not just the culture that had created it, but the universal human impulse to transform the merely functional into the transcendent, to take the basic need for clothing and elevation it into art. Constantine found himself before a bolt of white silk so pure it seemed to generate its own light in the moonlit warehouse. The fabric was unmarked by pattern or color, yet it possessed a beauty that surpassed the most elaborate decorative pieces around it. This was silk in its essential form, a reminder that sometimes the greatest artistry lay in knowing when to stop, when to let natural beauty speak for itself without human embellishment. The night air moved gently through the warehouse, stirring the lighter fabrics in a whispered dance that seemed to give them temporary life. Constantine watched this subtle animation and understood that he had spent his life in service to something larger than commerce, something that connected him to every human being who had ever paused in wonder before beauty, who had ever felt the need to preserve and share what moved them most deeply. His memory, which had always been remarkable for faces and details, now revealed itself as something more profound, a capacity for recognizing and remembering beauty in all its forms, an ability to see the sacred in the secular pursuit of loveliness. The silk merchants who had become his friends, the artisans whose work he had championed, the customers who had trusted his judgment, all had been part of a community united not by geography or politics, but by shared reverence for human creativity at its finest. As the moon reached its zenith, flooding the warehouse with silver light that transformed every surface into something magical, Constantine understood that his life's work had been a form of devotion as pure as any monk's prayers. He had served beauty, and through beauty he had served the divine spark that moved human hands to create wonders that outlasted the civilizations that birthed them. The silk around him would survive whatever came next, carrying forward the testimony of human aspiration made manifest in thread and pattern, color and texture. The warehouse breathed around him, filled with the accumulated beauty of a lifetime's careful selection, and Constantine felt complete in a way that transcended the uncertainty of the world beyond these walls. He had been privileged to spend his life in the presence of such loveliness, and that privilege was its own form of prayer, its own testament to the enduring power of human creativity to transform the mundane into the miraculous. The weight of manuscripts. Maximus Planudes the Younger moved through his scriptorium with the deliberate slowness of a man who had learned to trust his hands more than his eyes. The failing vision that had crept upon him these past months now seemed less curse than blessing, forcing him to feel his way through the accumulated treasures of a lifetime's devotion to learning. Each manuscript he touched carried within its vellum pages the weight of centuries, the breath of minds that had wrestled with eternity and left their findings bound in leather and hope. The candlelight flickered across the familiar spines, creating dancing shadows that seemed to breathe life into the ancient words contained within. Aristotle's logic, copied in his own careful hand during those long winters when he was still young enough to believe that preserving knowledge was simply a matter of ink and patience. Plato's dialogues, their margins filled with his own questions and discoveries, conversations across time that had shaped his understanding of what it meant to seek truth. The mathematical treatises of ancient Alexandria, their geometric proofs as elegant and eternal as the movements of stars. His ink-stained fingers traced the spine of a particular volume, and he felt rather than saw the familiar binding. The metaphysics, copied from a manuscript so old its edges crumbled at the slightest touch. He had spent 3 years on that single work, rising before dawn to catch the best light, his young eyes straining over faded Greek letters that seemed to dance and blur in the lamplight. Now, holding it again, he could feel the slight unevenness where his hand had trembled during those final pages, rushing to complete the work before winter made writing impossible. The monastery's stone walls held centuries of prayer and scholarship in their very mortar, each stone placed by hands that understood the sacred nature of preservation. Through the narrow windows, the first pale suggestion of dawn touched the golden horn, painting the water in shades of pearl and silver that reminded him of the illuminated capitals he had once painted with such pride. But inside the scriptorium, time moved differently, measured not in hours, but in the patient accumulation of wisdom, the slow conversation between minds separated by centuries, but united in their hunger for understanding. Dust motes drifted lazily in the amber light, each speck a tiny universe suspended in the eternal moment between night and day. He watched them dance, remembering how as a young monk he had seen in their movement the same patterns described by the ancient astronomers, the same mathematical relationships that governed the movement of planets and the growth of flowers. Everything connected, everything part of a larger design that revealed itself only to those patient enough to look. Maximos reached for a piece of oiled cloth, his movements careful and deliberate. The recognition had come not as revelation, but as gentle settling, like dust finding its natural place after disturbance. He understood now that his life's work had never been about the physical preservation of these texts, though that had seemed so urgent, so necessary. The real preservation happened in the reading, in the moment when ancient thoughts took root in living minds, when Aristotle's questions became the reader's questions, when Plato's insights sparked new understanding in souls not yet born, when the philosopher walked through Athens. He began to wrap the first manuscript, his hands moving with the tenderness of a father touching a sleeping child's face. The cloth would protect the vellum from moisture, from the rough handling that might come, but he knew now that the true protection lay elsewhere. Every student who had ever puzzled over these pages, every monk who had copied passages into his own commonplace book, every scholar who had argued with these ancient voices in the margins of his own thoughts, they were the real preservation, the living library that no siege could touch. The weight of the manuscript in his hands felt different now, lighter somehow, as if understanding its true nature had freed it from the burden of mortality he had placed upon it. Knowledge, he realized, was like water. It found its own level, flowed around obstacles, seeped into the smallest cracks of consciousness where it could wait, patient and eternal, for the right moment to spring forth again. The books were vessels, precious and beautiful, but the knowledge they contained transcended any single vessel. Outside, the city stirred with the first movements of morning. He could hear the distant sound of footsteps on stone, the soft murmur of voices as the world prepared for whatever this day might bring. But here in the scriptorium, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of ages, Maximos felt himself part of something larger than any single day's events. He was a link in an unbroken chain of preservation and transmission, a guardian not just of books, but of the human capacity to question, to wonder, to seek meaning in the vast mystery of existence. He wrapped another manuscript, then another, his movements becoming a kind of prayer. Each fold of cloth was an act of faith, a declaration that somewhere, somehow, curious minds would again seek out these thoughts, would wrestle with these questions, would add their own insights to the great conversation that began when the first human looked at the stars and wondered. The manuscripts might survive, or they might not, but the conversation would continue, carried forward by voices he would never hear, in languages not yet spoken. As the morning light grew stronger, filtering through the scriptorium's windows and painting everything in shades of gold and amber, Maximus completed his careful work. The wrapped manuscripts lay before him like sleeping children, protected as well as mortal hands could protect them, but already released from the desperate urgency that had driven him through the long night. He had done what he could, and in doing it had discovered what he had always known but never fully understood, that his true work had never been preservation but participation, joining his voice to the eternal chorus of human inquiry. He blew out the candle and sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of years and the lightness of understanding settle over him like a familiar cloak. The scriptorium grew quiet around him, but it was not the silence of ending. It was the deep quiet of continuation, the patient pause between one movement of a great symphony and the next. In that silence, he found a peace he had never expected, a quiet acceptance that would carry him gently into whatever dreams awaited, knowing that the conversation would continue, eternal and unbroken, long after his own voice had joined the vast chorus of those who had wondered before him. The bread that remains. Anna Paleologina's hands found their rhythm in the dough before her mind had fully awakened, muscle memory guiding her through the familiar motions her grandmother had taught her in this same kitchen 30 years ago. The flour dusted her forearms like benediction, each fold and turn of the dough a prayer learned in childhood, when the world seemed vast and permanent, and the idea that empires could end was as foreign as the languages spoken in distant lands. The bakery's stone oven radiated gentle warmth, its fire glow painting everything in shades of amber and gold that reminded her of the illuminated manuscripts she had glimpsed once in the Hagia Sophia. But this was her own kind of illumination, the daily miracle of flour and water and yeast transforming into sustenance, into the staff of life that had fed Constantinople's children for as long as anyone could remember. Her hands worked with their own intelligence, kneading with the perfect pressure that came from years of practice, feeling for the moment when the dough would achieve that particular elasticity that meant it was ready to rest and rise. Flour dust hung suspended in the air like tiny stars, settling slowly on wooden surfaces worn smooth by generations of bakers who had stood in this same spot, working this same miracle with the same patient devotion. Through the shop's windows, Constantinople slept under a blanket of pre-dawn mist rising from the Bosphorus, the city's breathing seeming to synchronize with her kneading rhythm, creating a meditation on sustenance and survival that connected her to every woman who had ever fed her family. The sweet yeast scent rose in the warm air, carrying with it memories of countless mornings when she had risen before dawn to begin this work, when her children were small and would pad barefoot into the kitchen to steal bits of raw dough, their faces flour-dusted and sleepy. She could see them still in the dancing shadows cast by the oven's glow, little Theodorus with his serious eyes, always asking why the bread rose, why the fire made it brown, why people needed to eat at all. Maria, with her quick hands, already showing the instinct for the work that would have made her a fine baker if the world had continued as it was. But Anna understood now that the world continuing as it was had never been the point. Every loaf she had ever shaped had carried within it this moment's meaning, the recognition that the simple act of feeding others was the most fundamental expression of love, transcending any particular day's circumstances or any empire's fate. The bread she made today might be the last bread ever baked in this oven, but it would still be bread, still carry within its crust and crumb the accumulated care of all the hands that had shaped it. She divided the dough into portions, her movements automatic, but infused with a new kind of attention, as if she were seeing the process clearly for the first time. Each small mound of dough contained the potential for nourishment, for the moment when someone would break bread and feel, however briefly, that they were cared for, that someone had risen before dawn to ensure they would not go hungry. This was the real work, she realized, not just the mixing and kneading and baking, but the love that moved through these actions like yeast through dough, invisible but essential. The familiar ache in her shoulders spoke of countless mornings like this one, the sweet burden of work that served others. Her grandmother's voice seemed to echo in the warm kitchen air, teaching her the old songs that made the kneading easier, the rhythms that turned labor into prayer. "Bread is the beginning," the old woman had said, "and bread is the end. Everything else is just the time between one meal and the next." Anna had thought it simple wisdom then, the kind of thing old people said to make their lives seem more important than they were. Now she understood it was profound truth. The bread was indeed the beginning, the first gift a mother could give, the foundation upon which all other gifts could rest. And it was the end, too, the final offering, the last service one could perform, ensuring that others would be fed, would be sustained, would have the strength to continue whatever needed continuing. She shaped the loaves with extra care, her fingers creating the traditional patterns her grandmother had taught her, the simple decorations that turned necessity into art. Each loaf was a small sculpture, a temporary monument to the idea that even the most basic human needs deserved beauty, deserved the attention that transformed mere feeding into communion. The patterns would disappear when the bread was broken and eaten, but for now they spoke of care that went beyond mere nourishment, of the human impulse to make even the simplest things lovely. The loaves went into the oven with a soft sound, settling onto the hot stones, with the quiet confidence of things finding their proper place. Anna watched through the oven's opening as the heat began its work, the dough slowly transforming, rising and browning according to laws as reliable as sunrise, as eternal as hunger itself. This was the mystery she had participated in every day without fully understanding it. The transformation of simple elements into something greater than the sum of their parts, something that could sustain life and bring comfort and create the foundation for everything else humans did. As the bread baked, filling the kitchen with the aroma that had perfumed her entire life, Anna sat in her grandmother's chair and felt the weight of continuity settle around her like a familiar shawl. She was part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the first woman who had discovered that grain could be ground and mixed with water and transformed by fire into something wonderful, and the chain would continue forward through whatever changes came, because people would always need bread, would always need the love that moved through the simple act of feeding others. The first light of dawn crept through the windows, painting the flour-dusted surfaces in shades of pearl and gold. Soon the city would wake, and people would come seeking the bread she had made in the darkness, seeking the nourishment that would carry them through whatever this day might bring. She would serve them as she always had, with the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered, work that connected her to every baker who had ever risen before dawn to ensure that others would not go hungry. The bread was ready now, golden and perfect, carrying within its crust all the love she had kneaded into the dough. Anna smiled as she pulled the loaves from the oven, understanding finally that this was enough, this simple offering, this daily miracle of transformation and care. In the warm kitchen filled with the scent of fresh bread, she found a peace she had never expected, a quiet acceptance that her life's work had meaning beyond any single day's ending, beyond any empire's fate. The bread would remain, and with it the love that made it possible. Children in sleep. Theodora Cantacuzeno sat beside her children's bed in the blue hour before dawn, her hand resting lightly on the coverlet that rose and fell with their breathing like the gentle swell of a calm sea. In sleep, their faces held the perfect innocence she had fought to preserve through all the months of growing uncertainty, and she understood now that this moment, this simple watching, contained everything that had ever mattered in her life or ever would. Moonlight filtered through silk curtains she had woven herself, casting gentle patterns across the children's faces that shifted and danced like living things. Little Constantine lay on his back, one arm flung out in the unconscious confidence of a child who had never doubted that the world would keep him safe. His breathing was deep and even, the breath of someone whose dreams were still filled with adventures and discoveries rather than fears. Beside him, Maria had curled into herself like a flower closing for the night, her dark hair spread across the pillow in waves that caught the silver light. Theodoros, the youngest, lay between his siblings with the absolute trust that came from being the baby of the family, protected and cherished by everyone around him. His small fist was closed around the carved wooden horse Constantine had made for him, holding tight to this treasure even in sleep, as if some part of him understood that holding tight was important now, that the things we love must be grasped firmly lest they slip away in the darkness. The room held the particular quiet of sleeping children, deeper than ordinary silence, filled with dreams and growing, and the mysterious work that happens when young bodies and minds repair themselves for another day of wonder. Theodora had sat like this countless times before, watching over them through fevers and nightmares and the ordinary restlessness that sometimes claimed them, but tonight felt different, charged with a significance that made every breath precious, every small movement a gift to be treasured. Outside, Constantinople rested in the deep quiet that comes just before dawn, the ancient stones holding their breath as if the city itself were listening for something just beyond hearing. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains, bringing the faint scent of jasmine from the courtyard garden where dew was beginning to form on petals and leaves, where the world was preparing for another day with the patient optimism that characterized all growing things. But here in this room, time seemed suspended, held in the perfect amber of maternal love, observing its objects in their most vulnerable and beautiful state. Theodora understood now that all her worries about the future, all her careful plans and preparations had been missing the essential point. The future was not something to be secured or controlled. It was something to be met with love, and love was not a strategy or a plan, but a way of being present to what mattered most. She thought of all the nights she had spent lying awake, calculating and worrying, trying to imagine how to protect them from whatever was coming. The irony was not lost on her that the protection she had been seeking was already here, already complete, in the simple fact of loving them completely. They were safe, not because the world was safe, it never had been, but because they were held in love so absolute that nothing could diminish it, no matter what external circumstances might change. Constantine stirred slightly, making the small sound children make when they're dreaming of running or flying, and Theodora felt her heart expand with a tenderness so vast it seemed to fill not just her chest, but the entire room, the entire world. This was what she had been put on earth to do, she realized. Not to achieve anything or accomplish anything, or leave any particular mark on the world, but simply to love these three small people with the fierce, protective, unconditional love that was the closest thing to divine grace she had ever experienced. Maria shifted in her sleep, turning toward the window as if even in dreams she was drawn to light, to beauty, to the promise of new days filled with possibilities. Her daughter had her father's artistic eye, could see beauty in things others overlooked, the way morning light fell across a stone wall, the pattern frost made on windows, the particular blue of the sky just after sunset. Watching her sleep, Theodora felt a surge of gratitude that Maria would carry this gift with her wherever life took her, this ability to find wonder in the world's smallest offerings. The weight of tomorrow, which had pressed on her shoulders for so many weeks, began to dissolve in the face of this eternal present. Three small bodies breathing in trust, in safety, in the absolute faith that love would sustain them. What more could any mother ask for than this perfect moment of their complete dependence on her care? They trusted her absolutely, and in that trust she found not burden but liberation, not responsibility but joy. She remembered her own mother sitting beside her bed like this when she was small, remembered the feeling of being watched over with such complete attention that sleep became not escape but sanctuary. Now she was the guardian of that sanctuary, the keeper of this small space where innocence could rest undisturbed, where dreams could unfold without fear, where love could do its quiet work of creating the foundation upon which everything else would be built. The first birds began their tentative songs in the garden, testing their voices against the growing light. Soon the children would wake, would need breakfast and attention and all the ordinary care that structured their days. But for now, in this suspended moment, Theodora felt herself blessed beyond measure to be the witness to their peace, the guardian of their dreams, the one chosen to love them with the kind of love that asked nothing in return except the privilege of loving. She adjusted the coverlet slightly, tucking it more securely around Theodoras's small shoulders, and felt the gesture contain within it all the gestures of care she had ever made or ever would make. This was enough, she understood now. This simple presence, this watching over, this love that flowed through her like water through a vessel, asking nothing of her, but that she remain open to its movement. In loving them completely, she had found the only victory that mattered, the only achievement that could never be taken away. As the room grew gradually lighter with the approach of dawn, Theodora settled more comfortably in her chair, content to keep this vigil for as long as they needed her to keep it. The children slept on, safe in their dreams, held in love so complete it seemed to create its own atmosphere, its own weather, its own small world where nothing could touch them but tenderness. In that watching, in that loving, she found a peace she had never expected, a quiet acceptance that this was what she had been made for, this perfect attention to perfect innocence, this guardian love that asked nothing but the privilege of loving. The merchant's ledger. Constantine Lascaris sat at his desk overlooking the Golden Horn as dawn light crept across the water, turning it to molten silver that reflected through his warehouse windows onto bolts of silk that seemed to glow with inner light. His pen moved across the ledger's final page with the same precision he had maintained for 20 years of trade, but as he recorded these last entries, he found himself seeing beyond the numbers to the faces they represented, the lives they had touched, the connections they had made possible. The warehouse around him held the accumulated beauty of a lifetime's devotion to commerce, but commerce understood now in its truest sense, not as the mere exchange of goods for profit, but as the ancient human art of bringing together what was needed with what was desired, what was distant with what was close, what was rare with what was treasured. Crimson silk from Trebizond hung in careful folds, its deep red catching the morning light like captured wine. Azure fabric from Damascus whispered secrets of desert nights and oasis mornings. Gold-threaded brocades that had traveled impossible distances to rest in this quiet room carried within their weave the patience of countless hands that had worked to create beauty for strangers they would never meet. The air carried the faint scent of sandalwood from packing boxes, mixing with the salt breeze from the harbor where ships rocked gently at anchor, their holds empty now, their purpose fulfilled. Constantine breathed in this familiar perfume of his working life and felt himself surrounded not by inventory but by stories. Each bolt of fabric a narrative of craftsmanship and trade, of relationships built across vast distances, of trust extended and honored between people who spoke different languages but shared the common tongue of fair dealing. He dipped his pen in ink and wrote the final figures, but the numbers seemed less important now than the memories they evoked. The Syrian weaver whose silk had bought his daughter's dowry, Constantine could still see the man's face, weathered by sun and lined with the concentration of one whose life was spent in the pursuit of perfection. They had never spoken the same language, but they had understood each other perfectly through the medium of quality recognized and fairly valued. The Genoese captain, whose trust had become friendship over years of reliable transactions, whose letters from distant ports had brought not just news of markets, but glimpses of a wider world where human nature remained constant even as customs changed. Captain Benedetto, with his careful hands and his eye for beauty, who had wept openly when he first saw the silk tapestry Constantine had commissioned for his daughter's wedding, understanding that he was not just carrying cargo, but participating in the creation of joy. Constantine set down his pen and looked around the warehouse with new eyes, seeing it not as a repository of goods, but as a museum of human connection. Every transaction recorded in his ledgers had been, at its heart, an act of service, bringing beauty into lives that hungered for it, providing the materials from which celebration and ceremony could be woven, facilitating the small luxuries that transformed mere existence into something approaching art. The countless customers whose lives had been touched by beauty he had helped bring to their world paraded through his memory like figures in a tapestry. The young bride, whose wedding dress had been cut from silk so fine it seemed woven from moonbeams. The monastery that had commissioned altar cloths of such magnificence that even the most worldly visitors fell silent in their presence. The merchant's widow, who had found comfort in surrounding herself with beautiful things after her husband's death, understanding instinctively that beauty was not vanity, but necessity, not luxury, but medicine for the soul. He thought of the network of relationships that had made his work possible, the weavers and dyers, the ship captains and caravan masters, the fellow merchants in distant cities who had extended credit based on nothing more than reputation, and the mutual understanding that commerce at its best was built on honor. This was the true prophet, he realized now, not the coins that had accumulated in his strongbox, but the web of human connection that commerce made possible, the trust that grew between strangers who found they could depend on each other across vast distances and cultural differences. The morning light grew stronger, painting the silks in ever-changing hues as the sun climbed higher over the Bosphorus. Constantine closed the ledger with a sense of completion that had nothing to do with the arithmetic of profit and loss, and everything to do with the recognition that his life's work had been meaningful in ways he was only now beginning to understand. He had not just bought and sold goods, he had facilitated beauty, enabled celebration, made it possible for people to surround themselves with objects that lifted their spirits and reminded them that the world contained wonders worth preserving. A bolt of purple silk caught his eye, its color so deep and rich it seemed to hold within it all the mystery of Byzantine emperors and distant kingdoms. He remembered the day it had arrived, how the entire warehouse had seemed to hold its breath as he unrolled it for the first time, how even his most practical assistants had stopped their work to admire the way light moved across its surface like water over stones. That silk would outlast him, would grace some celebration or ceremony he would never see, would carry forward the accumulated skill and care of all the hands that had brought it into being. This was what he had really been trading in all these years, not just fabric and thread, but the human capacity for creating and appreciating beauty, for transforming the raw materials of earth into objects that could lift the spirit and gladden the eye. Every transaction had been a small victory for the idea that life should contain more than mere survival, that humans deserved to be surrounded by things that spoke to their highest aspirations rather than just their basic needs. As the harbor began to stir with the day's first activities, Constantine rose from his desk and walked among his silks one final time, his hand trailing across fabrics that represented the work of countless artisans, the dreams of countless customers, the patient building of trust across the vast network of trade that connected Constantinople to the world. He had been privileged to be part of this great enterprise of human connection, this ancient dance of need and fulfillment that had brought beauty into the world and made life richer for everyone it touched. The ledger lay closed on his desk, its final entries complete, its story told in the careful script of a man who had understood that true accounting went beyond numbers to encompass the immeasurable wealth of human relationships built on mutual respect and shared appreciation for beauty. In that understanding, he found a peace he had never expected, a quiet satisfaction that his life's work had served something larger than profit, something as enduring as the human hunger for beauty and as reliable as the trust that made all commerce possible. The church of Hagia Theotokos held its breath in the pre-dawn darkness, waiting for Father Gennadios Scholarios as it had waited for 30 years of mornings. His sandaled feet whispered against marble worn smooth by centuries of faithful passage, each step a quiet percussion in the sacred silence. The familiar weight of his vestments settled around his shoulders like the embrace of old friends, the golden threads catching what little light the oil lamps provided. He moved through the preparation with hands that knew every gesture by memory, lighting the altar candles with movements refined by decades of repetition. The flames sprang to life one by one, pushing back shadows that seemed deeper this morning, more reluctant to retreat. Somewhere across the city, other bells began their tentative morning call, but here in this small sanctuary, time moved according to older rhythms, The icons gazed down from their golden backgrounds with expressions that had remained constant through the rise and fall of dynasties. St. John Chrysostom's painted eyes held the same compassionate intensity they had possessed when Constantinople was young. The Virgin Hodegetria extended her blessing with hands that had never wavered, never doubted, never feared the changing of earthly kingdoms. Father Gennadios felt their presence like a cloud of witnesses, all the saints and martyrs who had prayed these same words, lifted these same offerings. In the growing candlelight, he noticed details that daylight often obscured. The way the gold leaf on St. Nicholas's halo had worn thin at the edges, touched by countless fingers over the centuries. How the Virgin's blue robe seemed to shimmer with an inner life, as if the pigments themselves had absorbed the prayers of generations. These painted faces had watched over births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows, the endless cycle of human joy and suffering that played out in the shadow of the altar. He began the liturgy alone, his voice carrying the ancient Greek syllables into air that seemed to shimmer with invisible presence. The words rose from his throat without conscious thought, shaped by muscle memory and heart knowledge that transcended the mind's understanding. Blessed is the kingdom of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and unto ages of ages. The response should have come from a congregation, but the silence that followed felt full rather than empty, as if voices from across the centuries were joining their amens to his. The morning light began its slow infiltration through the small windows, painting the interior in gradations of gold and amber. Dust motes danced in the slanted rays like tiny souls ascending, and Father Gennadios found himself thinking of all the mornings he had stood in this exact spot, speaking these exact words. How many times had he lifted the chalice? How many times had he broken the bread? The numbers dissolved into meaninglessness, leaving only the eternal present of worship. His thoughts drifted to his predecessor, Father Maximos, who had served this altar for 40 years before him. The old priest had moved with the same deliberate reverence, had spoken these same prayers with the same quiet conviction. Father Gennadios could almost see him now, a ghostly presence moving parallel to his own actions, the two of them separated by decades but united in the timeless rhythm of the liturgy. The church held the memory of every priest who had served here, their prayers layered like sediment in the very stones. His hands moved through the familiar choreography of consecration, fingers that had grown arthritic with age still remembering the precise angles. The sacred gestures passed down through an unbroken chain of ordination stretching back to the apostles themselves. When he raised the bread, he felt the weight of every Eucharist ever celebrated, every priest who had ever stood before an altar and dared to speak the words of transformation. The liturgy continued through its ancient progression, each prayer a stepping stone across the river of time. Father Gennadios found his voice growing stronger as the service deepened, as if the words themselves were feeding him, sustaining him for whatever this day might bring. The Trisagion rose from his lips like incense. Holy God, holy mighty, holy immortal, have mercy on us. Outside, he could hear the city beginning to stir, the sounds of a world preparing for siege. But inside this sanctuary, the only reality was the eternal conversation between earth and heaven. He paused in the familiar cadence, allowing the silence to deepen around him. In this pause, he could feel the weight of history pressing against the church walls. How many times had this city faced conquest? How many times had these prayers been offered in the face of uncertainty? The Persians, the Arabs, the Bulgars, All had threatened these walls, and still the liturgy continued, still the candles burned, still the faithful gathered to break bread and share wine in memory of one who had promised that not even death could separate them from love. When he came to the great entrance, processing alone around the altar with the chalice and paten, Father Gennadios felt the presence of all the deacons who should have accompanied him, all the servers who should have swung the censers, all the faithful who should have bowed their heads in reverence. They were there, he knew, separated only by the thin veil between the visible and invisible worlds. The communion of saints was not a doctrine, but a lived reality, as tangible as the marble beneath his feet. The morning light had grown stronger now, streaming through the windows with increasing warmth. It caught the silver of the chalice, transforming it into something that seemed to burn with inner fire. Father Gennadios held it carefully, remembering the weight of it in his hands on his first day as a priest, how his fingers had trembled then with the magnitude of what he was attempting. Now the trembling came from age, but the awe remained constant, perhaps even deeper after 3 decades of daily encounter with mystery. The anaphora began, that great prayer of thanksgiving that transformed bread and wine into something beyond earthly understanding. His voice dropped to a whisper for the words of institution, the same words Christ had spoken in an upper room in Jerusalem, words that had echoed through every generation since. Take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you, for the remission of sins. The bread in his hands seemed to pulse with life, and he understood with sudden clarity that this moment existed outside of time, that every Eucharist was the same Eucharist, every offering the same offering. The morning had fully arrived now, painting the church interior in shades of rose and gold. Through the windows, Father Gennadios could see the great dome of Hagia Sophia in the distance, that architectural prayer that had dominated the city's skyline for nearly 1,000 years. Today might be its last day as a Christian church, but the prayers it had contained would continue echoing in the hearts of the faithful, wherever they might scatter. He found himself thinking of the children he had baptized in this font, now grown and scattered across the empire. Some had died in distant wars, others had married and raised families of their own. A few had taken religious vows, carrying forward the flame he had helped kindle in their hearts. In this moment of consecration, he felt connected to all of them, to every soul he had touched in his ministry, every confession he had heard, every blessing he had pronounced. He consumed the consecrated elements alone, feeling the wine warm his throat like liquid light. This, too, was part of the eternal liturgy, the priest as representative of all humanity, receiving the divine gift on behalf of those who could not be present. In his solitude, he contained multitudes. In his individual prayer, he voiced the longings of every human heart that had ever sought the sacred. The bread dissolved on his tongue with a sweetness that seemed to spread through his entire being. He thought of all the grain that had grown in Anatolian fields to make this loaf, all the hands that had harvested and ground and kneaded, all the ordinary human labor that had been transformed into this moment of transcendence. Even in the face of siege and conquest, the earth continued to yield its gifts. The sun continued to ripen the grain. The rain continued to fall on just and unjust alike. The final prayers flowed from his lips like water from a spring, natural and inevitable. "Let us depart in peace," he intoned, though there was no congregation to dismiss, no one to receive his final blessing. But as he extinguished the candles one by one, Father Gennadios realized that departure was impossible. The liturgy never truly ended. It simply continued in the silence between words, in the space between heartbeats, in the eternal now that connected all moments of worship across time. The last flame flickered and died, but the church did not return to darkness. Instead, it seemed to glow with an inner light, as if the prayers of 30 years had saturated the very stones with luminescence. Father Gennadios stood for a long moment in the growing daylight, his hands still tingling from contact with the sacred mysteries, his heart full of a peace that surpassed understanding. Somewhere in the city, the sounds of preparation for siege continued, but here in this small sanctuary, he had touched something that no earthly power could conquer or destroy. The liturgy would continue in other places, in other voices, in other languages perhaps, but always the same essential prayer rising from human hearts to the divine mystery that surrounded and sustained all things. As he prepared to leave, Father Gennadios genuflected one last time before the altar, his knees finding the familiar worn spot in the marble where countless others had knelt in adoration. In that gesture, he joined himself to every act of worship that had ever been or ever would be, finding in that continuity a peace that would carry him gently through whatever darkness lay ahead, knowing that the light he had tended here would never truly be extinguished. The morning sun now filled the church completely, and in its golden embrace he felt the presence of every dawn that had ever broken over this sacred space, every prayer that had ever risen from these stones, every heart that had ever found solace within these walls. Join us for more quiet moments from history, where literary storytelling meets peaceful sleep. Subscribe for stories that honor both the art of narrative and the gift of rest.